You know that feeling when your world starts to crumble and you'll do anything to hold it together? That's how it was with Nathan. I loved him with everything I had. He wasn't just my boyfriend, he was my future. Or so I thought. When the doctors told us Nathan had severe liver disease, my heart stopped. The man I loved, who always seemed so invincible, was suddenly fragile. His chances weren't great unless he found a donor, and without hesitation, I raised my hand. "Test me," I said. Everyone thought I was crazy. My best friend Claire gave me a long speech about how risky it was. "Amelia, think about yourself for once," she said. My mom, who always tried to stay out of my business, even chimed in. "Are you sure, honey? This isn't something you can undo." But none of that mattered. Nathan needed me, and I wasn't about to let him down. "I love him," I told them. "This will bring us closer. He'd do the same for me." Would he? That thought crept into my mind late at night when I couldn't sleep, but I pushed it aside. Nathan was my everything, and I'd do whatever it took to save him. The surgery itself was brutal. I don't think I fully grasped what I was signing up for until I was lying in that hospital bed, feeling like my insides had been ripped out. The recovery was slow and painful, but every time I looked at Nathan, I told myself it was worth it. He was alive because of me. I thought that meant something. I clung to the idea that this would be a turning point for us, that Nathan would realize how much I loved him, how far I was willing to go for him. In my head, I imagined us years down the line, stronger than ever, telling our kids how mommy saved daddy's life. It was this big romantic story, and I was the hero. But as I lay in that hospital bed, stitches fresh and body aching, I noticed something odd. Nathan seemed distant. At first, I chalked it up to the stress of recovery. He was tired, overwhelmed. I told myself things would get better once we were back home, in our little apartment, where we'd find our rhythm again. I didn't realize then that the story I was telling myself, the one about love, sacrifice, and happily ever after, was just that, a story. One I'd written in my head, but one Nathan wasn't reading the same way. Still, in those moments, I believed with all my heart that saving him would save us. I didn't know it then, but I was about to learn how wrong I was. The days after the surgery were a blur of pain and hope. Every movement reminded me of what I'd done, but I told myself it was worth it. Nathan was alive, and that's all that mattered. At least that's what I kept repeating in my head. At first, Nathan seemed grateful. He'd sit by my bedside, hold my hand, and tell me how much he appreciated what I did. "You're amazing, Amelia," he'd say, his voice soft. "I don't deserve you." Those words were like a balm, easing the pain of recovery. I clung to them like a lifeline. But as the weeks went by, something shifted. Nathan stopped staying as long during visits. His texts grew shorter, more matter-of-fact. When I moved back to our apartment, he wasn't there waiting with flowers or a warm embrace. Instead, I walked into a space that felt colder than it ever had before. "It's just the stress," I told myself. He's still recovering too. I made excuses for him, brushing off the growing distance between us. But deep down, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Something was wrong. One evening about a month after the surgery, Nathan invited me to dinner. He even said he'd made a reservation at my favorite restaurant. My heart leapt at the gesture. Maybe this is it, I thought. Maybe he's planning something special to thank me. I got ready with more care than usual, picking out a dress Nathan once said he loved and curling my hair just the way he liked it. As I looked in the mirror, I felt a flicker of hope. "We're going to be okay," I whispered to my reflection. At the restaurant, Nathan seemed nervous. He kept fidgeting with his fork, barely touching his food. I tried to fill the silence, asking about his day, his work, anything to get him to relax. But he wasn't meeting my eyes. Finally, he set his fork down and took a deep breath. "Amelia, there's something I need to tell you," he said, his tone serious. My heart raced. For a split second, I thought he might propose. Instead, his next words shattered my world. "I'm in love with someone else," he said bluntly, as if ripping off a Band-Aid. "Her name is Jenna. She works with me." I blinked, sure I'd misheard him. "What, Nathan? What are you talking about?" He sighed, avoiding my gaze. During everything I went through, the surgery, the recovery, I realized that life is short. It made me see what's really important, and Jenna is who I want to be with. My breath caught in my throat. Jenna? You mean your coworker? The one you always said was just a friend? Nathan nodded, his expression unreadable. I didn't plan for this to happen, Amelia. It just did. I can't ignore my feelings. Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I gave you my liver, Nathan, I said, my voice trembling. I sacrificed a part of myself for you. And now you're telling me this? He finally looked at me, his eyes cold. I didn't ask you to do that, Amelia. You chose to. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Are you serious? I saved your life. I'm grateful, he said flatly. But gratitude isn't love. I stared at him, searching for any sign of the man I thought I knew, the man I loved. But he was a stranger now. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How long have you been seeing her? Nathan hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. It doesn't matter, he said finally. What matters is that I need to be honest with you. It's over. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in on me. After everything I've done for you, you're just walking away? What about Will? What about everything we've built together? Nathan's face hardened. I can't stay in a relationship out of guilt, Amelia. I need to follow my heart. His words were a knife twisting in my chest. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. You're a coward, Nathan, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You don't deserve what I gave up for you. I didn't wait for his response. I grabbed my bag and walked out of the restaurant, tears streaming down my face. The pain in my chest was unbearable, a mix of heartbreak and betrayal, so intense it felt like it might consume me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Nathan's words echoed in my mind. I didn't ask you to save me. No, he didn't. But I did it anyway, because I loved him. And now I was left with nothing but scars, inside and out. After that night at the restaurant, everything crumbled. I stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping. The little strength I had left from the surgery seemed to drain out of me completely. My body felt as broken as my heart, and no amount of rest or kind words could fix it. Days blurred into nights. I barely left the apartment except for necessities. The thought of running into Nathan and Jenna kept me glued to my couch, the curtains drawn, the air heavy with silence. The scar from my surgery throbbed occasionally, a painful reminder of what I had given up, for nothing. Friends tried reaching out. Lisa, my best friend, came by more than once, knocking gently before eventually letting herself in with the spare key. She'd bring food and sit with me, trying to coax me into eating or talking. You can't let him do this to you, Amelia, she'd say, her voice firm but kind. You're worth so much more than he ever deserved. But I didn't feel worth anything. I'd replay her words in my head later, but they felt hollow. The hurt was too deep, too raw. I couldn't see beyond it. All I could think about was how I'd failed. Failed to be good enough for Nathan, failed to hold my life together, failed to see that the person I loved most was slipping away. The worst part was the scar. Every time I saw it, I felt a wave of nausea. I'd stare at it in the mirror, tracing the faint line with my fingers, and wonder why I even bothered. I'd given Nathan a piece of myself, quite literally, and he'd thrown it away like it meant nothing. One night, about a month after Nathan left, I hit rock bottom. It started with a simple thought. What's the point? It crept in quietly, at first, like a whisper in the back of my mind. But the longer I sat there in the dark, staring at the blank TV screen, the louder it got. The thought grew, fed by every painful memory, every cruel word, every sleepless night. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. My chest ached and tears streamed down my face. I couldn't stop them if I tried. I grabbed my phone, scrolling aimlessly through messages from friends, missed calls, voicemails I hadn't listened to. There was one from Nathan, cold, matter-of-fact, telling me to stop contacting him. So I deleted it without listening to the whole thing. By the time the thought fully formed, just end it, Amelia, it felt almost like a relief. The idea of stopping the pain, of silencing the endless cycle of hurt and humiliation, was comforting in a way that scared me. I wasn't thinking about the future or my family or even Lisa. All I could see was the void, and it seemed better than the life I was living. I found myself in the bathroom, staring at the bottle of painkillers the doctor had prescribed after my surgery. My hands shook as I picked it up. "It's not worth it, Amelia," a small voice in my head said, but it was so quiet, drowned out by the roar of despair. I don't remember much after that. I sat on the floor, clutching the bottle, the cold tiles pressing against my skin. I cried until I couldn't anymore, until my throat was raw and my head pounded. At some point, I must have fallen asleep there because I woke up hours later, the morning sun streaming through the small window. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stir inside me, a tiny spark of anger, of defiance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me put the bottle back on the counter and walk away. That moment didn't solve everything. It didn't magically heal the scars, inside or out. I don't remember making the decision to drive to the bridge. I only remember standing there, staring down at the swirling water below. The wind was cold, biting at my skin, and the world felt muted, like I was underwater already. My heart pounded in my chest, a strange mix of fear and calm. The cars behind me honked occasionally, but none stopped. No one noticed me standing on the edge. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Not Nathan, not Jenna, not even the scar that had been my constant reminder of pain. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and stepped forward. But I didn't hit the water. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't at the bridge anymore. I wasn't anywhere familiar at all. I was surrounded by a vast, dreamlike void, a soft, endless expanse of white and silver. It wasn't cold or warm. It just was. I looked down at myself and realized I was still wearing the same clothes, but they felt lighter somehow. My body didn't ache. The heaviness that had clung to me for weeks was gone. Instead, I felt oddly weightless, like I could float if I wanted to. "Where am I?" I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness. "You're in between." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating softly but powerfully. I turned and saw a figure emerge from the void. They were shrouded in light, their features impossible to make out, but their presence was calming, almost familiar, like an old friend you couldn't quite remember. "Between what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Between what was and what could be," the figure replied. They moved closer, their steps silent against the nothingness. "It's not your time yet, Amelia." I blinked. "Not my time for what? I made my choice. The figure raised a hand, and I felt a strange warmth wash over me. "You think you've reached the end, but your story is only beginning. You have a greater purpose, one you've yet to discover." Tears pricked my eyes. "I don't understand. I'm broken. I don't have anything left to give. Why should I go back?" The figure tilted their head, their voice softening. "Because you are stronger than you know. Because the world hasn't seen the best of you yet, and because your pain can become your power, if you let it." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to argue, to cling to the hopelessness that had consumed me, but another part, the smallest, quietest part, felt a flicker of something. Hope? Determination? I wasn't sure. Before I could respond, the figure stepped back, their form starting to dissolve into the light. "This is your second chance, Amelia. Use it wisely." And just like that, the void vanished. I gasped, my lungs filling with air as my eyes flew open. The first thing I noticed was the blinding white of the hospital ceiling. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, and the faint beep of a heart monitor hummed in the background. My body felt heavy, yet strangely alive. I wasn't dead. I blinked slowly, my mind racing to catch up. How was I here? The last thing I remembered was the bridge, the void, the figure. The memory felt like a dream, but the ache in my chest told me otherwise. "Amelia, you're awake." A nurse appeared beside me, her face a mixture of relief and curiosity. "You gave us quite a scare." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and scratchy. She handed me a cup of water, and I sipped it gratefully, letting the cool liquid soothe the rawness. You were found near the bridge early this morning, she continued. Someone called it in. You're lucky to be alive. I nodded weakly, the weight of her words sinking in. Lucky. That wasn't how I'd felt when I stepped off that bridge. But now, I wasn't so sure. As she checked my vitals, I noticed something odd. Her expression was calm, professional, but there was a flicker of something else, a faint tension in her jaw, the slightest hesitation in her movements. It was like I could feel her stress, even though she didn't say a word. You're doing fine, she said, her voice steady. But then, out of nowhere, a thought drifted through my mind like a whisper. I hope I don't miss the kids' recital tonight. I froze. What? The nurse glanced at me, confused. What, honey? I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Did you say something about a recital? Her brows knitted together. No, I didn't say anything like that. My heart pounded. I wanted to brush it off, blame it on my groggy state or the meds they'd probably pumped into me, but it didn't feel like a hallucination. It felt real. Over the next few days, I stayed in the hospital for observation. At first, I chalked up the strange whispers to the trauma I'd endured, but it didn't stop. Every time I spoke to someone, a nurse, a doctor, even the janitor, I'd hear fragments of thoughts, like distant echoes in my mind. The nurse who checked my IV. I need to switch shifts with Kelly tomorrow. I can't deal with another double. The doctor reviewing my chart. She's young, probably just a cry for help. She'll bounce back. The janitor sweeping the floor. Wish my son would call me. It's been 3 months. It was overwhelming, like standing in the middle of a crowded room with everyone talking at once. At times, it was unbearable. I'd press my hands to my temples, willing the voices to stop, but they wouldn't. They were always there, buzzing at the edge of my consciousness. One afternoon, a kind social worker came to visit me. Her name was Linda, and she had a warm, empathetic smile that reminded me of an old friend. She pulled up a chair beside my bed and began asking gentle questions about my well-being and plans for the future. I nodded along, answering as best as I could. But then, as she leaned forward slightly, I heard her. She looked so lost. I wish I could do more for her. I stared at her, my chest tightening. You really mean that, I said softly. Linda blinked, taken aback. Mean what? That you wish you could do more for me? I said, my voice trembling. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she was silent. Then she smiled, though it was tinged with confusion. Of course I do, Amelia. That's my job. But I could tell she was startled. How did she know? Did I say that out loud? I didn't push further. I just nodded and thanked her for her kindness, my mind spinning. This wasn't a fluke. It wasn't my imagination. I could hear people's thoughts, clear, unspoken words that no one else could hear. When I was finally discharged, I felt like a different person. My senses were sharper, my awareness heightened. Walking through the hospital lobby, I caught snippets of thoughts from every direction. I hope I didn't forget the groceries in the car. Why does my back hurt so much? The meeting at 2 can't come fast enough. It was like I'd been given a new set of ears, tuned into a frequency no one else could hear. It was disorienting, but also empowering. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stir inside me, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in ages. I wasn't sure why this was happening to me or what I was supposed to do with it, but one thing was certain. I wasn't the same Amelia who had stepped onto that bridge. Something had changed, and I was determined to figure out what. When I stepped off the bus into the unfamiliar city, the chill in the air felt like a clean slate. I had nothing to my name except a suitcase of clothes, a few $100s in my bank account, and a burning resolve to never let anyone break me again. I had to get away from Nathan, Jenna, and everything that tied me to my old life. It wasn't just about healing. It was about rediscovering who I was without their shadows looming over me. Before I left, I deleted Nathan's number, blocked him on every social media platform, and threw away every photo, card, or trinket that reminded me of him. It was cleansing in a way. I wanted to erase every trace of him from my life, like scrubbing off a stubborn stain. The hardest part was saying goodbye to people who had been part of my life, but were too connected to Nathan to remain in it. Mutual friends tried to console me, saying things like, maybe he'll realize his mistake, or worse, You should fight for him. But I was done fighting for people who didn't value me. The city was bustling, overwhelming, and expensive. My little savings dwindled faster than I expected. I found a tiny studio apartment with peeling paint and a heater that rattled like an old engine. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that was enough. Finding work, though, was a different challenge altogether. My resume was solid, but I'd been out of the workforce for months due to everything with Nathan and the surgery. Interview after interview, I was met with polite smiles and regretful nods. "We're looking for someone with more recent experience," they'd say. It was discouraging. Each rejection felt like a blow, but I wasn't about to give up. If there was one thing I'd learned in the past few months, it was how to survive. One day, after another grueling interview, I sat in a coffee shop, staring at the classifieds on my phone. The voices in the cafe were a chaotic hum in the background until one voice broke through. "I swear, if I have to sit through another boring pitch, I'm going to lose it. We need someone with fresh ideas, someone who can read the room and deliver." I looked up and spotted a sharply dressed man at the next table, talking to a colleague. My heart raced as an idea formed. My newfound gift could be the key to turning my life around. I spent the next few days refining my approach. I studied job descriptions, researched companies, and practiced using my ability to anticipate people's needs. When I walked into my next interview, I felt a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years. The interviewer, a woman named Karen, greeted me with a firm handshake and a professional smile. "Tell me, Amelia, why do you think you're the right fit for this role?" I paused, listening to the faint whisper of her thoughts. I hope she doesn't just repeat her resume. I need someone who can think on their feet. Instead of diving into a rehearsed speech, I said, "I believe a good marketer isn't just about ideas, but understanding people, what they want, what they fear, and what drives them. It's about connecting on a level that feels personal." Karen raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Interesting. Can you give me an example?" I nodded and drew from my observations of her office: a framed photo of her kids, a certificate for a community service award, and the subtle tension in her shoulders. For example, a campaign that emphasizes trust and family values would resonate with people juggling busy lives. It's about showing that you're not just selling a product, but a solution. Her lips twitched into a smile, and her thoughts echoed, "Finally, someone who gets it." By the end of the interview, Karen offered me the job. "Welcome to the team, Amelia. I have a feeling you're going to do great things here." The position wasn't glamorous, an entry-level role with long hours and modest pay. But it was a start. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. My ability to read people's thoughts became an asset, helping me navigate tricky office politics and tailor my ideas to exactly what my boss wanted to hear. Within weeks, I stood out. Colleagues began noticing my knack for anticipating client needs, and Karen often singled me out for praise during meetings. The job was demanding, but every late night and early morning felt worth it. I was building something, brick by brick, and no one could take it away from me. As I settled into my new life, I started to feel like a different person. I wasn't the woman who had sacrificed everything for someone who didn't deserve it. I wasn't defined by Nathan's betrayal or Jenna's smugness. I was Amelia, capable, intelligent, and stronger than I'd ever realized. Every step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream, not about someone else's happiness, but my own. This city, this job, this new beginning, it wasn't just a fresh start. It was the life I deserved, and I was determined to make the most of it. When I started at the firm, I was the newbie, the one who fetched coffee and stayed late organizing files. But I didn't mind. This was my shot at building a new life, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. From day one, I threw myself into the work. Every assignment, no matter how small, was an opportunity to shine. I made sure every report was flawless, every presentation polished. The hours were grueling, but I reminded myself that this was the life I was building. Not for Nathan, not for anyone else, but for me and my future. What set me apart, though, wasn't just my dedication. It was my ability to understand people, what they wanted, what they feared, what they needed to hear. My gift let me walk into a meeting and know the unspoken objections, the doubts they wouldn't voice aloud. It wasn't just an advantage, it was my secret weapon. One of my first big challenges came during a pitch to a major client. The team had been working on the proposal for weeks. But during the meeting, I could sense the client's unease. It's too expensive, the CEO's thoughts echoed, though his face remained neutral. I shifted gears mid-presentation. We understand that budget is a concern, I said, smiling confidently. That's why we've included flexible pricing options tailored to your company's growth. This isn't just a service, it's an investment. The CEO's posture relaxed, and I knew I had him. When we closed the deal a week later, my team couldn't stop talking about how I had read the room like a pro. Little did they know, I was reading more than just the room. Word spread quickly. Amelia has a knack for this, my colleagues would say. Some were impressed, others envious, but I didn't care. I was there to work, not to make friends. That said, a few coworkers, like Elena from marketing, became allies. Elena had a sharp wit and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded me of myself. She often joked, "You're going to run this place someday." Victor, the firm's managing director, was a towering presence in every meeting. He had a reputation for being tough, but fair, and when he called me into his office one day, I was nervous. "You've been making waves, Amelia," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. "Clients trust you. That's a rare skill." "Thank you," I replied, trying to keep my cool. "He's testing me," his thoughts whispered. "Let's see if she's ambitious." Victor leaned back in his chair. "I see potential in you, but potential means nothing without effort. Are you ready to put in the work?" I nodded, meeting his gaze. "Absolutely." From that day on, Victor became my mentor. He gave me challenging assignments, pushed me to think strategically, and shared lessons from his own career. He wasn't the type to hand out compliments, but when he did, they carried weight. "You're not just good, Amelia," he said once. "You're exceptional. Keep proving it." Of course, not everyone was thrilled about my rapid rise. A senior colleague, Richard, made it his mission to undermine me. In meetings, he'd interrupt or dismiss my ideas. I could hear his thoughts loud and clear. "She's too young, too green, she got lucky." Instead of retaliating, I used his arrogance against him. During one meeting, when Richard dismissed my suggestion, I smiled and said, "That's an interesting perspective, Richard, but let's consider the data." Then I presented a flawless analysis that left him scrambling for a response. By the end of the meeting, Victor pulled me aside and said, "Well played." Months turned into a year, and my efforts paid off. Victor called me into his office again, this time with a smile. "We're promoting you to senior account manager," he said. "You've earned it." I felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just a job, it was proof that I could rebuild my life. With the promotion came a better salary, a corner office, and more responsibility. It was a far cry from the girl who had been discarded by someone who didn't see her worth. As I climbed the ranks, I occasionally thought about Nathan, not with longing, but with clarity. He had taken so much from me, but in doing so, he had unwittingly pushed me towards something greater. Every late night at the office, every hard-won deal, every small victory was a reminder that I didn't need him or anyone else to define my worth. This was just the beginning. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And for the first time in a long time, I felt unstoppable. When I started pitching my own projects, I felt a surge of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. Each idea was like a piece of myself, and putting it out there for others to see was both thrilling and terrifying. I knew I had something special to offer, though, and I wasn't about to let fear hold me back. One day, I presented an idea for a client's new marketing campaign. The room was full of senior executives, and I could hear their skepticism before I even opened my mouth. What could she possibly bring to the table? They wondered. But I didn't let that faze me. "Picture this," I began, my voice steady. "We position your product as a lifestyle, not just a tool. We create stories around it, stories people see themselves in. It's not about selling, it's about connecting." As I spoke, I could feel the room shift. Doubts turned into curiosity, then into interest. By the time I finished, I knew I had them. When the campaign launched months later, it became one of the company's most successful projects, bringing in record revenue. Victor, my mentor, took notice. He started involving me in higher-level discussions, giving me opportunities to shine. Our relationship deepened, built on mutual respect and understanding. One evening after a long day of meetings, we stayed late in his office going over a critical proposal. As we wrapped up, he leaned back in his chair and said, I wasn't always this confident. Early in my career, I felt like an imposter. I looked at him surprised. You? An imposter? I can't imagine that. He smiled faintly. It's true. I struggled with self-doubt for years, but then I realized something. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up, doing the work, and trusting that you belong. His words stayed with me. They reminded me of how far I'd come, from a broken-hearted woman who didn't know her worth to someone carving out her own path. As my confidence grew, so did my independence. I started pushing boundaries, not afraid to take risks. I pitched bold ideas, some of which were met with resistance. But even when a pitch didn't land, I learned something valuable and came back stronger. By the end of my third year at the firm, I had built a reputation as someone who could think creatively and execute flawlessly. Clients requested me by name, and my coworkers respected me, not just for my skills, but for the way I carried myself. I wasn't the scared, uncertain person I used to be. I was Amelia, and I was finally proud of who I'd become. One day, Victor pulled me aside after a meeting. "You're ready for more," he said. "Have you thought about taking on a leadership role?" The offer stunned me. A leadership role? Me? But as the thought settled, I realized something. I wasn't just ready. I was eager. I accepted the challenge, stepping into my new position with a sense of purpose and pride. Life had given me a second chance, and I was making the most of it. It started with a chance encounter at a cafe. I was grabbing coffee during a break when I spotted a familiar face, Samantha, an old friend of Nathan's. I hadn't seen her since before everything fell apart, and though I hesitated, she waved me over. After some small talk, Samantha leaned in and said, "Have you heard about Nathan?" I stiffened. "No, I haven't spoken to him in ages." She shook her head, a mix of disbelief and pity in her expression. "Well, it's a mess. He got fired a few months ago. Something about mismanaging funds at work. And Jenna? She's barely holding on. Apparently, he's been living off her and causing all kinds of problems." Hearing Nathan's name still stirred something in me. Anger, maybe, or a faint echo of pain. But mostly, I felt curiosity. What had he been up to since he walked out of my life? That evening, I couldn't shake the conversation from my mind. Part of me wanted to let it go, to focus on the life I'd built for myself. But another part, call it closure, wanted answers. So I used my gift. Through a few discreet inquiries and some quiet eavesdropping, I pieced together the truth. Nathan hadn't just been fired. He'd been caught manipulating accounts to cover his overspending. He'd always had a taste for luxury, and it seemed Jenna had been footing the bill. From what I gathered, Jenna was growing tired of him. Her thoughts were loud and clear whenever I caught glimpses of her at events. "I can't believe I fell for his lies. He's just dead weight." The more I learned, the more I realized how far Nathan had fallen. He wasn't just unemployed. He was desperate. Jenna had started cutting him off financially, and he was scrambling to find anyone who would lend him money. It was a strange feeling, seeing the man who once made me feel so small now, struggling to keep his head above water. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly, but there was a sense of justice. He had made his choices, and now he was facing the consequences. As I sat in my apartment that night, I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who would have bent over backward to help Nathan, even after everything. That woman was gone. I wasn't his safety net anymore, and I never would be again. I closed my laptop, a small smile on my face. Nathan's life was his own mess to clean up. And mine? Mine was just beginning. The decision to confront Nathan wasn't one I made lightly. For years, I'd rebuilt my life, distancing myself from the pain he caused. But the more I learned about his behavior, his manipulation of Jenna, his fraudulent activities, the more I realized he hadn't just hurt me. Nathan was a ticking time bomb, and I couldn't let him continue destroying the lives of others. The first step was to gather concrete proof. My skills came in handy. Using my connections and my mind-reading ability, I started digging into Nathan's history. It wasn't long before I uncovered a treasure trove of unethical behavior. Bank transfers that didn't add up. Emails subtly coercing colleagues into covering up his mistakes. Expense reports that reeked of fraud. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture. Nathan wasn't just a manipulative ex, he was a criminal. I also kept tabs on Jenna. While I had no intention of involving her directly, her frustrations with Nathan gave me insight into his current schemes. She frequently thought about the financial strain he'd put on her, how he had promised to turn things around, but never did. Her resentment was growing, and I knew it wouldn't be long before she reached her breaking point. The next step was deciding how to proceed. Exposing Nathan wasn't about revenge, though I'd be lying if I said the idea of seeing him squirm didn't bring me a certain satisfaction. It was about justice. He had hurt too many people, and it was time for him to answer for his actions. I compiled everything I had into a detailed dossier: financial fraud, manipulation, and even instances of workplace harassment. It was all there. I knew exactly who to send it to: his former employer, the regulatory authorities, and a few key reporters who would ensure the story reached the public. But first, I wanted to confront him face to face. Not out of kindness or closure, I didn't owe him that, but because I wanted him to know that I was the one holding him accountable. I arranged a meeting under the pretense of wanting to reconcile. A part of me hated the idea of pretending to care, but I knew it was the only way to get him to open up. Nathan's ego had always been his biggest weakness. If he thought I was still under his spell, he'd drop his guard. The plan was set. With the dossier ready to be sent at a moment's notice, I felt a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. This time, I wasn't the one being blindsided. This time, I held all the cards. I met Nathan at a small cafe in the city, one I used to frequent during our relationship. As soon as I walked in, I could see the shift in his demeanor. He looked nervous, unsure of why I had reached out. His thoughts betrayed him. Does she still love me? Maybe she'll take me back. I pushed down the wave of disgust and forced a polite smile as I sat across from him. Thank you for meeting me, I began, keeping my tone light. I just felt like we left things unresolved. Nathan relaxed slightly, his ego inflating. I was surprised to hear from you, to be honest, but I'm glad you reached out. I've missed you, Amelia. It took everything in me not to roll my eyes. Really? Because it seems like you've been pretty busy, I said, tilting my head. Jenna must keep you on your toes. His face tightened, but he recovered quickly. Things didn't work out with Jenna, he admitted, his voice laced with bitterness. She couldn't handle the stress. She couldn't handle you, I thought, but kept quiet. Instead, I leaned forward slightly. Nathan, can I ask you something? Do you ever think about us? What went wrong? The question caught him off guard. For a moment, I saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. Then, as I expected, he launched into self-pity. I wasn't in the right headspace back then, he said. After my illness, everything felt so chaotic. I made mistakes, but Amelia, I've always cared about you. And the lies? The manipulation? The fraud? I asked, my voice sharp. He froze, his mind racing. What are you talking about? I know everything, Nathan, I said calmly. The fake expense reports, the coercion, the way you used Jenna to cover your tracks. His expression shifted from shock to panic. Amelia, I can explain. Don't bother, I interrupted. I've already compiled all the evidence. Your former employer, the authorities, and a few choice reporters are about to get very busy. Nathan's bravado crumbled. Please, Amelia, don't do this. I made mistakes, but I can fix them. I can fix us. There is no us, Nathan, I said, my voice cold. You took everything I gave you, my love, my trust, even a piece of my body, and you threw it away. You don't get to ask me for anything. He reached across the table, desperation etched on his face. Amelia, I'm begging you. I was wrong. I'll make it right. Just don't ruin me. I stared at him for a long moment, then leaned in. You ruined yourself, I said softly. I'm just making sure everyone knows it. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight of his betrayal. Nathan had made his choices, and now he'd face the consequences. The next morning, the dossier was sent, and I didn't look back.